What's your take on being able to, an individual being able to engage in self-destructive behaviour? So at what point should the state intervene, if it should intervene at all?
Goodness me. Gosh, that's. I suppose I think the sentiment would be if somebody wants to do self-destructive behaviour for a year, they put up their hand, and a year later they still feel like they want to do that, then we should license that. But I think this actually, now that you mention it, it does actually go into my own view of smoking, because I I don't smoke, and I think, but my emphasis is people can smoke as long as they don't affect others. But we have problems in units, we have problems with people walking down the street, this sort of thing. Now, in the abstract, if someone had a real sort of hermetically sealed unit and they wanted to smoke in their hermetically sealed unit without affecting others, not a problem. If people wanted to set up, clubs in industrial areas that were staffed by people who were chain smokers and smokers could visit that area, that could be an exception to our laws. But the thing is, if people want to smoke, really, they should have private health insurance, to actually cover the consequences of what they're doing. So I suppose cigarette smoking is a form of self-harm that's not as in your face as a lot of other things. But I remember actually doing a fair bit of thinking about this, because I hang around with some anti-smoking groups that are not as much into personal freedom as I am. And, well, there's also the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. And I was actually thinking, at what point do you are you imposing too much risk on yourself? And I suppose the thing about the drink driving laws, I mean, 0.05, that doubles your chance of accident, and 0.08 triples your chance of accident. So you can see the state has actually said, if you take risky behaviour and you double the risk over the background, that's where we'll draw the line. So when there's degrees of risk, I'm sort of saying, all right, you can double the risk on the background, but beyond that, we start to get careful with it.
Even a good anarchist wants to draw the line.
Self-harm, which is a bit milder in its consequences and its details. And so the thing is that with smoking, like if we went down to a farmer's market and bought tobacco from some individual guy who's growing it around his back shed or whatever, notice how different that is to smoking a cigarette from a large corporation, which to my way of thinking has a financial incentive for you to injure yourself.
Yeah.
And notice I'm not against smoking, but I do get concerned about large corporations with a financial interest. And then, okay, look, I'm going off on quite a rabbit hole, but you have prompted me, because one of the things about smoking is, are people enjoying a cigarette? And it depends on who you talk to. I know some people who said when they first started to smoke, you could say there was a meaningful nicotine rush, and you could say, I enjoyed this cigarette and then I enjoyed that one. But when you get into the old chain smoking one after the other, you're a slave to the addiction. It's no longer meaningful to say that you're enjoying the cigarette. But the cigarette companies say we are enabling people's freedom and we're letting people enjoy cigarettes. And there's a certain hypocrisy in their language. Yeah. But notice the distinction I'm making between buying some tobacco leaves from a guy at the local farmer's market as compared to the large corporate entity that financially benefits from you committing acts of self-harm. But but getting back to your original question, I think the cigarettes do actually start to illustrate what we're wanting to do. But let's say if somebody wants to harm themselves and they want to do it for a whole year, and they take some sort of insurance, or if they're dependents, they have life insurance, or they're made some sort of arrangement so their action doesn't affect others, and they still want to do it after a year, then I guess we should let them do it. And like some of my more radical ideas about drugs, that basically if you want to take drugs, well, do a course into pharmacology, botany, growing stuff. And at the end of that course, not only will you be fully philosophically informed about what you're doing, you'll have all the knowledge, all the pharmacological knowledge, and you'll sign a power of attorney. So if you go off the rails, we know what to do about you. And then you can go off and take drugs, and good luck to you. Notice the way that I'm relating to the risk involved in taking drugs. But, this is the whole thing of harm minimization. And if you do ecstasy, there are people there who make sure that you've got water and will test the drugs for you, and that's harm minimization and so on. And, I think that's a good thing, and, yada, yada, yada. But okay, so to bring back to your thing, the issue is, to some degree, if someone wants to commit an act of harm, we want to make sure they're not affecting anybody else and the state's not paying for their choices. And then, let them do it for a year. And then, okay, we've ticked a few boxes and people can actually harm themselves. Now, it gets to the idea of, is someone mentally ill if they want to harm themselves? And my gosh, that's quite a quagmire in itself. And my gosh, I guess I know the history of mental illness and just how, I guess, a social phenomena, the idea of someone being mentally ill is, and just how problematic that is. And I think it was Foucault. I get my Foucaults and Derridas confused, but I think it was Foucault who was sort of giving a very strong thing about that. And yeah, mental illness is quite a quagmire, I must say. But anyway, so I've sort of answered your question. By golly, I've meandered a lot.
A follow-up question on that is, I'm totally on board with the social harm. And just to give you some quick contextual understanding is, when I joined the police, I was like, well, I kind of like believed all the stuff that I was fed at high school, which it wasn't lies and propaganda, incidentally, as much as people try to make out. But it was like, hey, drugs are bad and you need to avoid them. And, yes and yes. But people do choose to do these things, and they're consenting adults who want to do stuff in their own home. My libertarian instincts want to let people stick whatever they want in their body. But the policeman in me who sees the social harm aspect, so let's move away from stuff like cannabis and stuff like that, which really does have very serious social harm, incidentally. But something that's more easily identifiable is obviously your methamphetamines. Like, if you've ever seen anyone on a meth rage in public, as I have, and then had to try to restrain them, as I have, you can take it from me that it's no picnic, and the social harm aspect is serious. And I don't even just mean like social disorder. Some of the really serious assaults, murders, rapes, and stuff like that I've been to have been linked to this drug. I mean, you're an anarchist, I'm a libertarian. But how does a good anarchist and a good libertarian, how do we balance the social, how do we measure social harm? Where do we draw the line in saying, well, and how do we make it real? How does it play out in the real world? Like, if you want to take meth, you can, but you got to stay in a house. Like, what does it mean? What does it look like? How are we going to apply the principles in the real world, I suppose?
Well, I think the way that you would regulate the taking of meth is to have a place where people can do it. And not only do they pay for the meth, but they also pay for the, I guess, supervision that goes along with that. So that we say, if you really want to take it, you pay through the nose for it, but we can be sure that you won't harm others. And to some degree, you may well harm yourself, but I think it's better to have, as it were, a safety valve in society where you can actually go and take meth in a controlled environment. And the other thing to keep in mind is, I'm not sure what the street value of these drugs is, but I suspect that if you had shall we say, a credible medical grade coming out of a pharmaceutical company that wasn't trying to profiteer from it, and you had a market generated drug, and then you added the costs of sort of like administering you in this compound or whatever, it probably wouldn't be that much more than the current market value on the streets. I'm not sure, but yeah, that and the thing is, the way I would do that is the sentiment would be, we don't want to encourage people to take meth, but at least there's a safety valve. If you really want to find out what the fuss is about, here's how you can go about doing it. So that would be my compromise, because I think an outright ban encourages curiosity and so on. Now, look, some people, I guess, like the drug culture because it's illegal and because it's criminal, and you can't, I guess, solve that, because what we're doing is making it half legal. But what you can do is solve the itching curiosity that people might have, and so that's the way that I would actually do it. That a lot of things are illegal in certain. Notice I was talking about smoking. Let's have a smoking in a club that is an industrial area and all the staff are chain smokers and you can visit and smoke if you really bloody want to. And obviously the employer has to have some sort of workers' comp insurance for their staff who are ridiculous, who are smokers. Oh my gosh, that gets complicated and maybe you can't buy the insurance, but well, that means it's not going to happen. But you can have very selected exceptions, and by gosh, you actually want to have those things renewable every 5 years by tender. Anyway, never mind. But there are ways of sort of having
we can do it. Yeah, yes, we can. To quote Barack. My next question, and it's along the same lines, is because I've discussed this with a number of people, including some. I'm really keen to get some free drug, legalize everything, people on air. I've had magnificent discussions off air, but none of them will come on yet. I'm working on one, John. Is who should control the production? Now, a surprisingly high number of people, and I suspect because some of the people that I'm talking to are kind of like left inclined to saying, well, the government should do it. And their rationalization is because it takes the profit issue out of it, which kind of makes sense. But my argument against that, well, my concern, it's not even an argument against because I'm just thinking it through. My concern with that is like, okay, the government will make money out of this. Like, trust me, but they're never going to, it will be too much of a temptation. Like we tax the hell out of all these luxuries, alcohol, tobacco, all these kind of other things. They will pump up the price of your meth and your heroin and whatever else they want to take. And that means effectively that you're going to have the government making drugs, arguably, well, if not hooking people on, okay, because, they're trying to, but like making drugs and profiteering off the suffering and misery of people who are addicts. So my question would be to a good anarchist, like, who should be producing this? And how are we going to control the production line and the supply chain?
Well, I suppose that the thing is, what we want is to give people an outlet, but we don't want the government to, as it were, profiteer. So we don't want the government to be addicted to the money. But I suspect that there's a lot of cash flows in our world. And like, I seem to remember there was a story about our New South Wales Premier who wanted to get rid of poker machines in New South Wales. And when he actually got into government, where there were some bureaucrats from Treasury that tapped him on the shoulders and explained to him the realities of the world as they saw it. Now, I in a sense, I don't have, now this is, I will try to get back to your particular issue, but I have nothing against gambling as such. But when there's large corporate entities that benefit from people abusing their own lives, and there's this old story that the majority of people who engage with poker machines are in some way addicted to the poker machines as compared to having a flutter and making choices and so on. There's stories of people queuing up at the clubs at 9 a.m. to get in to play the pokies. I mean, it's telling you something's wrong. But yeah, so we're talking about pokies and the problems there. But so the government, yes, that's right. The government is actually addicted to that cash flow, and it's going to take a hell of a thing in terms of finances. But there's also the pubs and clubs lobbies that have their own talons in government. So that's an example of a problem there. But let me say, there's two things that are poles apart, which is, the poker machines everywhere. A bunch of people in a smoke-filled room playing cards. That's, I guess, one of the most ethical forms of gambling. And strange to say, the old SP bookies that used to, well, who knows, maybe they still exist. But the point is, if you engage with that service, you've got to show a damn amount of initiative to seek it out and engage with it. So for my way of thinking, that's actually putting a bit of an appropriate bar that the people who really bloody want to can. But when you have, TABs on every street corner or something like that, and I'm sort of saying, no, when you have pubs on every street corner with poker machines, I go, no, let's have, 5 casinos in Sydney, renewable by tender, and those are the only places you have poker machines. But anyway, let me see now, you were saying about drugs. So what we want to do is facilitate the safety valve without government getting addicted to that. And what you could do is have some sort of tenders that people apply for competitively. There might be 5 or 10 licenses. So there's a competitive bid. So in a sense, between the market and the business people, there's this sort of balancing. And so some money comes into government. And you want to set up some formula where the amount of drugs that is being consumed is sufficient to operate as a safety valve, but not so large that it's actually a money-making exercise.
Yeah.
So that's the trade-off you'd have to make. And one of the things about government is, like, a lot of things are very rubbery. And the thing is, you pick one number, and then there's this queue of people who will lobby you and say, oh, just another 5%, pretty please. And that's a sort of quagmire you get into, where I think a lot of vaguely reasonable government initiatives suffer the death of 1,000 cuts over 10 years of lobbyists sort of whacking away at them. So you do want to avoid that. But you're saying, look, there's problems with the government doing. There perhaps are problems with what I've described, but maybe there's fewer problems with the way I've described it. But in a sense, you have to have, for the sakes of argument, a minister who's pretty up on economics, game theory, psychology, public administration, and maybe with a bit of wisdom into the mix, maybe they could actually pull it off. And there's going to be all these people saying, oh, you should do this. Oh, you should have done it that way. Oh, why don't you change the number to this? Why don't you change the number to that? And they would have to stand firm against that pressure and just say, look, this is the way we're doing it. It won't be perfect, but it's the choice I've made.
So what's a good anarchist and what's a good libertarian to do about thorny problems like this? When I was a street cop, and actually a little bit post, I dealt a lot with really serious street alcoholics, and there was this one chap actually who started to develop a really small skin cancer just on his eye, just like little sun cancer. Mm-hmm. I saw him and I went, mate, you've got a sun cancer. You go and get that seen to. Yeah, stuff. There's nothing. And his addiction, kind of like, he didn't like going to doctors. He didn't want to go anywhere near them. Maybe they'd grab him and put him in the health ward or something like that. He had all these concerns. Not completely out of place either. Although that you can't force people to accept treatment. He didn't really understand that. But it came down to the cancer has now, and he's still on the streets of Cairns, the poor chap. It's got into his bone. It's taken his left eye, and you can see it going across his face. I'd be surprised if it's not in his brain. But still, even though we'd actually have to have tests, but I would be surprised again if it's not. It's definitely in his bone. Like even a layperson like me can tell, because you can see the mushiness in his face. What do we do about people who prioritize something like that, like an addiction to alcohol, over getting self-treatment? Like, how do we as people who really put the sovereign individual and the primacy of human free will at the top of our reasoning, how do we deal with thorny issues like that? Like, is it okay? I mean, you could just talk about that generally, but if you're seeking a specific question.
Okay, well, let's say one compromise to this one. First off, are all people who are alcoholic similarly neurotic and paranoid? Because it's like the ideal that we have of the jury. And juries actually came from Greece and then Rome. And I think Rome, they actually had like hundreds of people in the jury, the idea being that you couldn't possibly bribe hundreds of people, sort of thing. But the point is, if you could actually get 6 other drunks who were moderately coherent, and then they would vote to basically have one of their fellows, sort of basically having some treatment forced on them. And then at least you have that process where it's not us that is doing it, but one of this drunk guy's peers. And I'm assuming that there are some drunk people out there who can actually think this through, even though they like their alcohol. They can say, look, your mate there over there, he's got a skin cancer. He's not doing something about it. We want to do something about it. We need your endorsement and your help, right? And now, the other thing to do with treatment of drunks, I've actually heard, various shrinks, psychologists, whatever you want to call it, they're sort of saying that, strange as it may sound, like with heroin, if you actually have access to a regular dose of heroin that you don't need to stress over, your life can actually come in order. And that's, now maybe you've heard those stories, and I don't believe they're made up. I think they are real, that people who are heroin addicts, when they actually get on a program and they know that they've got their next dose, they can actually start to hold down a job and things like that. And similarly, if you have vending machines that like give drunks a metered dose of alcohol every 4 or 5 hours, so they can't go troppo, but they know that the alcohol is there available. And okay, that's a cost to the taxpayer of having these things available. But you could actually treat these drunks in such a way that, because at least they have the certainty of the next dose of alcohol, they can start to think about their lives. Maybe I'm being a bit naive and overly optimistic there, but I do know at least one psychologist who worked in addiction, and he was telling me that, like, strange to say, with some addictions, you give people a metered dose that they know about and they can relate to. And once that source of stress is taken care of, their brain actually has a bit of space to think about the world at large. Anyway, but that's answering your particular question. We can't intervene in this person's life ourselves, but we have to delegate the authority to a council of their peers for the intervention to happen.
So I tried really hard to get this guy treatment, and it was kind of like, because I was talking to him, I formed a rapport with him. I said, mate, you know, come down to the hospital with me. We'll get all the stuff. Like, I got him coffee and food and stuff in the morning. Got him transport. I was out of the police, but I was able to call in some favours. I said, guys, you know, I got this bloke, whip him down to the hospital. So, I mean, you know, no arrest or nothing. Consent to jump in the back. Yeah, no worries. Boom. Down the hospital. Got to the point where he, to get a CAT scan, he had to take his clothes off. And because he kind of like knew that he stunk and he was dirty, and he had like a couple of earrings and stuff too. He kind of didn't want to, although they could get off that. No. You know, I'm just not doing this, because the belt would have been, there was all the things. So he kind of like left, and we've wrapped services around him. He's still alive, although he hasn't got long to go. We've wrapped services around him. We're keeping a real eye on him. And I was just discussing it one day on the street with all these, you know, paid service providers. And as you know, I'm out of the police. I'm just kind of like a interested civilian now. And we came to the consensus that really the right thing to do, and I mean in a moral, ethical sense, the right thing to do is to let this guy drink himself to death. And that's even understanding that, yes, he is an addict. So arguably he no longer really has human free will. You know, there's a question as to how much free will that this person has. But he let that, you know, he became an alcoholic. I mean, and it's so hard, it's so subjective, like whether the alcohol, I mean, no one held him down and forced him to have his first or second or third drink. And yes, there was a point that the alcohol took over and was in control of him. He was possessed. You know, possession is really the best way to talk about it, in the sense of, you know, I don't mean he was actually possessed by the demon of alcohol, but like that's how he acts and that's how it plays out. It's such a good analogy. And when you say that, people get it. So it's hard to say that when the point of possession actually happened. But it's still, I think, the right thing to do, to respect his will. And if he says, you know, I don't want to go to hospital, and yes, I know that I'm sick, and yes, I can't see out of my eye, and yes, my skull is literally mushy now, and it kind of is, like, you know, the real bad, it's spongy, it's so weird. I still think it's a strength in our society that we let people do that, because Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward, I'm sure you've read it, discusses this specific issue and comes to the same conclusion, basically, that doesn't matter how good your intentions are, you couldn't or shouldn't. It's probably a greater moral evil to force someone to accept treatment. And that was cancer. That wasn't even an addiction. So there wasn't the issue of possession and free will. Like, just a person went, you know what, I just don't want to do it. But it's so...
Well, that's a reasonable position. I've not read the book that you mentioned, but yes, that's a reasonable position that you outline. And it does seem like, in terms of self-harm, you're obviously very strongly at the libertarian end of the spectrum. Notice I had a whole lot of, I guess, hurdles for someone to jump through in order to do self-harm, but ultimately I was willing to license it after that. Because the thing is, I guess we live in a society, so I think society shouldn't really put arbitrary strictures on you, but equally, it's not like anyone's an island. Like, we have this relationship with the world around us, and that's sort of unavoidable. So on that basis, I suppose the world, the laws, whatever, have some prerogative to like structure what you're doing, but they shouldn't stop you from doing what you want to do.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, what you talk about this drunken person, it does sound like, I suppose I'm not sure it's just drunk, but people do seem to have this situation where they can't comprehend the future and can't relate to it. And it does sound like maybe that was part of, what was going on in his head, or he couldn't comprehend that like this thing will kill you if you don't do something about it. So
That was always our concern. So what we tried to do is like we came up with all these strategies, and it actually took a couple of weeks, John, to figure out his, because like, I wasn't watching this guy 24/7. We had to get to understand his pattern. So when he was the least drunk,
Mhm.
and we figured out that was round about 6:37 in the morning, round about 6 o'clock. So when he's because he'd normally finish drinking round about 3 or 4, and or if he had less money too, and we'd get him towards the end of the pensions. So the day before his pension was paid, a couple of days before his pension was paid, his universal basic income, I suppose you could call it. The day before his universal basic income was paid, the couple of days before that, he'd be running out of money, and he'd finish drinking around about midnight, 2. If he had a lot of money, he'd be drinking right through till 2, 3, 4. That would give him a few hours of sleep. So if we got him like right on sunup or right after sunup, that would be when we were talking to a sober person. And we made the distinction. It's like, well, we don't want to talk to the demon of addiction. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a literal sense. I mean it in a sense is we don't want to be talking to his addiction. We want to be talking to the person. And we actually came down in the morning, and look, I suppose I can just use his first name. His name's John, actually. So we're sitting there talking to him and going, "Oh, John," and I led the conversation because of me being ex-police. I kind of said, "John," talking to him. I said, "Mate, I've got a question for you, but I want to talk to John. I don't want to talk to the alcoholic. Can I talk to that person?" And he, like, it was kind of really funny. He got this, and as much as any human being can judge a moment of lucidity in another person, because we're all easily fooled, and that, I mean, I'm not perfect. I mean, I've got experience and stuff like that, but like, I'm flawed. Like, what do I know about another human being? And he goes, "Yeah, okay." You're talking to him, and like, he kind of became a slightly different person. He said, "Mate," and I said, "Mate, you're dying. Do you understand that?" And he goes, "Yeah," because he'd always been in denial a lot about the cancer. In the start from the beginning, "Oh no, it's not." Yeah, he goes, "Yeah, I know, I can't see it in my eye." So, mate, we want to save you. And I shouldn't have used that word, but that's the word I used. I should have said helped, facilitate, something like that, to give him a sense of control rather than helicopter. That was such a bad choice of word, but that's the word that I used. I said, "Mate, we want to save you." And he goes, "I don't want to be saved. I'm happy where I am. I know it doesn't look like to you, Matt, but I'm in a good place." Like, okay.
Well, he did actually articulate a sort of a way of looking at the world and the way that he saw it. So I guess that's fair enough. So
Yeah. Yeah, real.
so yes, you're right. It does sound just possible that help might have been a better word than save, because yeah.
Yeah.
But having said that, I know what it's like. Just too often in the heat of the moment, you can't choose the right words, and you do your best, and that's certainly the case. I mean, I've been in that situation myself. So you think about things after, oh, I should have said that. Oh, I should have said
Yeah.
that.
Could have, would
Yeah.
have, could have, would have, should have.